the British Labour Party came to power in July 1945. It had previously opposed the 1939 White Paper, but now proved as intransigent as its predecessors. Worldwide pressure and President Truman's demand for 100,000 refugees to be allowed into Palestine failed to move the Labour government. The Zionist organisations, both left and right, had spent much time in the war years recruiting Americans to the cause of Zionism. One of Truman's closest friends, who had access to the White House, had been made into a committed Zionist by Chaim Weizmann. Also, Brikar had moved 100,000 refugees into the American zone. If they were not allowed into Palestine, how would Truman have dealt with 100,000 Holocaust survivors in New York? The American Jewish community had finally found its voice. There were marches in major American cities. One banner headline read, "Aren't 6 million Jews enough?" In November 1945, the Foreign Secretary Ernst Bevin stated that his government would maintain the 1939 White Paper and restrict annual Jewish immigration to Palestine to 18,000 a year. He claimed that to do otherwise would harm British interests in the Muslim world, including some 90 million Muslims in India, and added that the Jews shall not overemphasize their racial position and should not get too much at the head of the queue. The Arabs were now recognized as the world's principal oil producers, and the Labour government claimed that because the Holocaust had tragically happened, there was no longer any need for mass European Jewish immigration to Palestine. Because Britain needed the American alliance, Bevin in November 1945 did agree to the establishment of an Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry to examine both the Palestine question and the position of the Jews in Europe. The United States Congress in February 1944 had already stated that Palestine should be open to Jewish immigration, so that the Jewish people may ultimately reconstitute Palestine as a free and democratic Jewish commonwealth. Military considerations persuaded the American government to reject Congress's demands, but general support for Zionist aspirations were developing. The Irgun, in particular, had galvanized American public opinion by staging huge pageants in honor of the murdered Jews of Europe. These pageants were led by famous Hollywood stars. Bevin's Anglo-American Commission was established in early 1946 with 6 British and 6 American representatives. The committee interrogated Jewish and Arab leaders and spoke to inmates of the DP camps in Europe. They recommended that 100,000 Jewish refugees be allowed into Palestine immediately, and that the British Mandate should henceforth be administered by the United Nations. President Truman confirmed his satisfaction and pointed out that the committee recommended the annulment of the 1939 White Paper. The British were fearing trouble from the Muslim world. At the end of the war, the government was faced with problems throughout the empire, the most serious India. The Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin el-Husseini, had managed to make the issue of the Arabs of Palestine into an Arab issue and also a Muslim issue. The government announced that they would not implement the Anglo-American Committee unless the Jews of Palestine surrendered all their arms. At the end of the war, realizing that a fight was inevitable, Zionist emissaries combed Europe looking for military hardware. The Jewish Agency argued that they could no longer trust the British, and they refused to surrender their arms. The Yishuv decided to launch a concerted political and military campaign against the implementation of the White Paper. The Haganah, the Palmach and the Irgun came together to mount joint operations. They managed in one night to blow up all the bridges that connected Palestine with neighbouring countries. The British responded on Saturday, September the 29th, 1946, later known as the Black Sabbath, by arresting many of the Yishuv and sending 2,000 to prison camps and declaring martial law. The Irgun, that had already begun operations against the British back in 1944, took independent action which culminated in the destruction of the military headquarters of the British at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 people. Begin, the leader of the Irgun, gave a warning to the British that was denied by the authorities. Meanwhile, the Irgun and the more extremist Lehi, under Itzhak Shamir, were carrying out military operations against British targets, both in Europe and in Britain itself. In May 1947, the Irgun organised a prison breakout from Acre Jail. 3 of the participants were arrested and sentenced to death. The Irgun captured 2 British sergeants and held them as hostages. They demanded the release of their comrades in return for the soldiers. The British refused to give in to what they called terror. They executed the 3 prisoners, and the following day, the bodies of the 2 British sergeants were found in a eucalyptus grove in Netanya. The British had a huge number of military personnel in Palestine at a time when the empire was falling apart and England bankrupt. Coinciding with these activities was the Bricha movement. This operation earned a great deal of sympathy for the Zionists. When newsreel footage was shown of British soldiers capturing Holocaust survivors and sending them to detention camps, the British reputation in the free world was diminished. The most famous of these ships was the Exodus. It sailed from southern France with 4,500 Holocaust survivors on board. It was first attacked outside of Palestinian waters by British destroyers, and several of the passengers were killed. To punish them, instead of sending them to Cyprus, they were sent back to Germany. The image of British soldiers imprisoning Jews behind barbed wire in Germany shocked the free world. By February 1947, Bevin announced he would refer the whole problem to the United Nations. In May 1947, the Assembly elected a committee called UNSCOP, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. Members of that committee were on the docks when the Exodus was escorted back to Haifa harbour en route to Germany. In August, the majority recommendation was to partition the country into a Jewish state, an Arab state, and an international area to include Jerusalem under international supervision. The plan was put before the General Assembly in November 1947. On the 29th of November, the United Nations approved the partition plan by a majority of 33 in favour, 13 against and 11 abstentions, amongst whom were the British.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.